Thank you so much for joining us today, Greg.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. And welcome to the Neurohacker office.
This is so exciting, you guys. I have been a fan of Neurohacker since you guys came out in 2016, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. As soon as Ben Greenfield mentioned you, I was like, oh, if Ben's doing it, let's check this out.
Yeah, he found us really early on. And I love the story on his, when he interviews Daniel, one of our founders, about how he first encountered Qualia.
How was it? What was
it? The story that I saw in this podcast was essentially someone came up to him at a conference somewhere and mentioned, oh, I have this God pill.
Yes.
And he was doing some type of, like endurance competition, yes, athletic, and this person rocked. And he's like, well, how did you do that? And that's where he first discovered Qualia.
I do remember that story very vividly. I'm like, oh, I want to be superhuman. Let's try this thing. Yeah. And it's so powerful. The first formulation of Qualia, by the way, we'll get to the interview in a second. Sorry, we're just going to chat about Qualia for a second. But the first formulation was so powerful, and I didn't know you needed to ramp up, that I was like, I'm going to take the whole thing right away. And then I was like, a Christmas tree of jittery lights. And I was like, oh, what's happening? And I called Neurohacker, and this is what I loved, is that I got a real person on the phone instantly who worked through with me. He's like, oh, you just have to ramp up. And he said, man, if you ramp up and you're still jittery, we will take the whole thing back. And I was like, man, I love companies like that. I just admire so much when their customer service is truly customer focused and you care.
Yes,
so
that's a big part of what we stand for sure.
It's incredible. And that you're here in San Diego, love. Yes. It's even more. Well, there's a million reasons why I wanted to have Dr. Kelly on today. And we're going to talk a little bit about how Qualia and other supplements like that Neurohacker is putting out, their different types of Qualia, help people who are in quitting type transitions. But we'll get to that in a minute. What we want to talk about starting off is that recently-ish, Dr. Kelly had a quit of his own. And it's one of my favorite types of quits because it seems small, but it can make a huge difference. Everybody thinks that on the show we have to talk about quitting a job, quitting a relationship. I say, man, sometimes I just quit my yoga membership, and that makes a big difference. So if you could tell us a little bit about your recent quit.
Okay, so just in context, I've quit a lot of big things, like you just mentioned. I was in the Navy for 5.5 years, so that was a big step to move out of that because, I loved the Navy, but at the time I felt like I'd outgrown it. But my recent thing is incrementally smaller, but in terms of my day-to-day productivity, it's been massive. So what I had gotten into a rut over the last couple of years was first thing in the morning, waking up and just booting up my computer. I'm a big sports fan, grew up in Boston, so I would check sports, read the Celtics blog, the Red Sox blog, and all of a sudden a half hour, 40 minutes would go by. Instead of getting to the gym right away or getting out and getting some morning light right away, I'd kind of wasted that period. And now, not to say I had to rush to get to work, but it was a much less leisurely start to my day. So around May, my big quit was I decided, like, no computer first thing in the morning. I immediately, when I get out of bed, my routine is I actually take Qualia. I'm currently taking mine, but the original stack that you mentioned, I had been on more over the summer. And so I'll take my Qualia, big glass of water, and then 4 of the days during the work week, I head to the gym. And then usually by the time I finish that, sun's up a little bit, but still early in the day, say 7-ish, we're San Diego, so lovely weather, so sit outside and have coffee and start to immerse myself in work, which often is catching up on research articles. So the big thing for me was just quitting that habit of popping the computer up and turning it on, because once I did, I almost was in a snowballing effect where time would just disappear in a fairly unproductive way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What was the impetus for the change?
I think it was 2 things. I think first and foremost was just a recommitment to take to maximize the early part of my day instead of, I guess, wasting some of it. And the second part was when I first started taking Qualia Qualia 2-step, I just found myself right out of the gate in the mornings really wanting to get at things. So I think it was a combination of me committing, but that actually helping me overcome the tendency to procrastinate personally.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. And in these habits, a lot of times they were serving a purpose, but then they had kind of a shadow side, right? Was there a good purpose that it was serving at some point?
I would say so from when I stopped practicing in the early 2000s, I tended to work remote in most of the jobs I've had. So it was really whenever I plugged in to start working was fine in terms of my daily work. And so I think over time I just had built in more procrastination from when I turned on my computer till I actually got into things. And so I think initially it probably started off as a good thing because I would be right into things first thing in the morning. I'm definitely a morning person. I'm not one of those people that struggles to get going in the day, but I just filled a lot of that beginning with fluff.
Yeah, I understand that. I think a lot of people listening to this show are going to resonate with the fact that they're working from home. Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily have to be on anybody else's schedule. So they know that they're probably going to be the most productive in that first chunk of the day. But once you open the computer, you can either get right to your deep work or you can get right to ESPN.
Right. And I think it wasn't ESPN so much, but that was just like in the wellness space or the biohacking space where there's, Ben Greenfield, we mentioned earlier, but there's lots of, brilliant places you could go every day and learn something.
Yeah. In
the sports world, there's also lots of great blogs, but not nearly as fulfilling to invest time in those, at least for me personally at this point. And so a big thing I wanted to do and that was able to do starting in May was to really kick that habit.
That's very cool. Was it difficult?
Honestly, no. One of the things that's been a truism for me when I start something new, and I started with Neurohacker Collective the beginning of May.
Okay.
If I can get right into a groove out of the gate, kind of quit a bad habit, put a new thing in place, then it self-perpetuates. But if I start when I'm beginning a new thing, the bad habits would also perpetuate. So I'm really cognizant of transitions and trying to make, conscious decisions right when a transition's happening, because I just found over my life that perpetuates good habits.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for people who are going through quits, which is a huge transition.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there may be a lot of stages where they could do what you did. It's like, okay, it's not a New Year's resolution time, but there are other times where you say, okay, it's a new beginning. What habits do I want to bring with me to this new thing? So if you're in a side gig and finally you quit that main job, you're going to make that side gig your full gig. All right, now that you're not going to an office, you get to decide and architect out your day.
Yep.
What's it going to look like? I like that because we're coming up on New Year's and that's sometimes the only time that people stop and evaluate what's working. But there are many other transition points.
I think there's not, like for me, well, I know if you just think in terms of your book and the diet book industry, they'll often release books around the New Year's, but also around the beginning of the school year. Because those two periods are, because of how we've been raised, those are natural times to quit one thing and transition into something else. But there's opportunities all through the year. I know I was on the Mike Bledsoe podcast recently, and one of the things we were talking about was when we go on vacation. Because similar to what I just mentioned, I found if I'm going on vacation, say Europe for 2 weeks, the habits I get in the first couple of days perpetuate, good or bad. So if I find a way to exercise those first few days, then I'll exercise through the trip. If those first few days I never make the room for it, it's then easy all of a sudden for the vacation to have disappeared. And maybe the only thing I did was more walking than usual.
Yeah, that's very true. And coming back can be another transition time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Especially because we're tending to, okay, now I have to undo jet lag and undo all these other, maybe overeating for 2 weeks, or if we didn't exercise, then it's a great time to double down on whatever good habits we were trying to enact. I love this because so many in this space, so many people are talking about the morning routines, and they vary widely. But I think a very common thread is don't have the first thing you do be look at a screen.
Yes.
I think a lot of time just disappears there. I am very guilty of that. I don't open my computer, but so for me, this is kind of a catch-22. The first thing I do, I want to check my aura.
Oh, yeah.
So I open my phone to check my aura ring, like how did I sleep overnight? But then there's like 1,000 notifications that the OCD responder in me can't just ignore. Like, no, just look at the aura. So all of a sudden 20 minutes are gone. And I'm still lying in bed. I'm like, oh, I don't even know what my aura said, but I've checked 40 emails.
Right. So that was one thing for me because I used to open my computer in bed.
Oh wow.
And so, so that was one thing for sure. That's not on the menu anymore. Right? I don't even keep a computer in my bedroom, so that the temptation's a little bit gone. My phone, unless I'm flying somewhere and use my phone as an alarm clock, my phone doesn't stay in my bedroom either. So the temptation, I basically have to get out of bed if I want to engage with any of those things to start with.
Which is really smart. Yeah, I think a lot of us use the phone as an alarm, and it's all downhill from there. Do you have an actual physical alarm clock, or do you just wake up?
I have it's an old thing. I think I bought it at Brookstone that you can set in it. It has nature sounds to wake you up. But other than an early flight, I just naturally wake up.
Oh, that's really cool. I think another benefit of starting your day not on a screen, besides the productivity, is the adrenal issues. Because if you start your day, you wake up probably pretty equanimous, right? And say you check a sports score and it didn't go your way, right? Boston lost, or heaven forbid, or you get an email that's not something you wanted to see. Then all of a sudden your adrenals are firing and you've got this adrenaline going, and if you're trying to meditate or do the other things after that, I think it's a lot harder.
I agree. I'm a big fan of Hidden Brain, the NPR podcast, and they had an episode not too long ago, and I believe if you just do Hidden Brain tunnel vision, it would come up. But the gist of that presentation was this idea of bandwidth, and not that we could say like your bandwidth is X. We don't have a way really to measure it, but assuming we have some degree of bandwidth, the beginning of the podcast essentially talked about poverty, people that are struggling to meet their financial and basic needs, and how their bandwidth gets consumed with thoughts intruding about like, where am I going to get a little bit of money? And because of their bandwidth being consumed with that, they tend to make poor long-term decisions. The next thing that it touched on was something called the Minnesota starvation experiment, which was a World War II study where they had a bunch of conscientious objectors that they essentially wanted to experiment with them, put them on a long-term calorie-restricted diet, get them well below their normal weight so that they would mimic prisoners of war, so that they would have a better idea how to deal with the prisoners of war coming back from Europe. And one of the things they found in those men was that their bandwidth was consumed with thoughts of food. So even when they would put a nice movie on to distract them, they would fixate on the food scenes in the movie. Most of them started reading cooking magazines and like gourmet, things like that, whatever was available in World War II. And then the last thing they did in that particular episode was this woman that, like your background, medical doctor and super high performer. I think she was a class valedictorian on the way. And during her residency, she literally burned herself out. And the scarce commodity then wasn't food or money, it was time. And so the key thing in like this notion of bandwidth for me is that it's probably a relatively fixed pool for all of us, and that there's lots of things that can consume it if we're not careful. Now there's the big things like I mentioned and that they discussed in the tunnel vision episode, which will consume a lot of it. But there can be lots of little things that incrementally take slices, and all we're left with then is such a tiny sliver. It's really hard to perform at our best.
Yeah.
So I think going back to how I jumped into this, that beginning of our day, something like a sports score, something that starts your day off with, I guess, like, oh, what's going on here? Like something more stressful is going to cut into that bandwidth. And right away, the performance that you're capable of is now going to be squeezed a little bit.
Yes. Ooh, I love that you brought that up because that's so relevant in so many other things. It's the same thing with decision fatigue, right? You only have the bandwidth to make a certain number of decisions in the day.
Correct.
So, okay, we only have this much bandwidth for dealing with stress, this much for dealing with decisions. So that's something that people listening should realize, okay, optimize that by minimizing the unnecessary decisions or the unnecessary distractions. I took my Facebook and unfollowed every news thing because I'm in a period where I need to focus on my business. And people are like, well, how are you not following this Mueller investigation? I'm like, I can either follow the Mueller investigation or keep my business going. I can't keep sane and do both. I say that exact same thing. I have a limited amount of bandwidth, and right now it has to be, I can't fix the Mueller investigation. I am the one in charge of keeping my business running. So I think it's a much better spend of my time to put it on my business.
Absolutely. And I mean, it reminds me of a story. So I'm not going to mention any names, but back before I went to naturopathic school, I knew a naturopathic doctor very well in Hawaii. And huge heart, would take on anything that someone asked them to take on. And at one point, they essentially got to the point where they were almost cathartic. They felt like, oh, I can't do anything. And when I went over, I was trying to help them. And they said, you don't understand, Greg. I literally have committed to 3,000 things to do. Like some of them are small, just writing 3 recommendations to people so that they can apply to naturopathic school. But I don't even know where to begin. I have 3,000 things to do. And I noticed myself at one point when I was a student in naturopathic school, I had so many good things that I was trying to squeeze in my day that one morning I was lying in bed just thinking, where do I even start? And so it's not just necessarily the things that are obviously bad that we need to quit. Sometimes we've stacked so many theoretically good things that they're preventing us from being our best as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's always super important to take inventory and not be attached to the thing, be attached to how you're showing up in the big picture real world.
Exactly. The quit there for me is quit overscheduling myself. Because yes, I would love to do 3 podcasts a day. Mm-hmm. And I am so grateful that many opportunities come up. Everybody wants to be on the show, but I can't record that many a day and stay sane. Yeah. I have tried and I have found it does not work because there's no eating. Like I'll just go from one to the other. But it's 5 o'clock and I haven't had any meals and I can't eat. Like then how am I even cognizantly interviewing anybody at that point? Because the bandwidth is gone and there was no food to replenish it. So I love everything that we just talked about. We could talk down this road forever on focus and habits and okay. Maybe I'll have you back on for a second show.
That would be great.
That'd be amazing. I just want to get into how supplements, so tell us about Neurohackers supplements, because I don't think a lot of necessarily my audience is familiar with nootropics.
Okay.
So if you could start with a little bit about what a nootropic is and how it helps.
Okay. So nootropics really is a category of anything that could boost aspects of brain performance. So brain health, brain function. And they started back in the 60s with the discovery of something, it was a racetam. It's the category of compounds which are more drug-like than what would be dietary supplements, but you certainly see them sold like pushing the boundaries sometimes. And really what was discovered is that these compounds could improve focus, attention, things like basically some portion of our cognitive capacities. Now, if we think of, I would say in terms of the most used nootropic substance in the USA, it's going to be coffee or caffeine. Yeah. So coffee is an interesting thing. I know when I went through naturopathic school in the early 90s, coffee was one of those bad things. But as it turns out, coffee lowers risk for diabetes. It lowers risk for some cancers. Coffee has a lot of things, at least where it's correlated with health outcomes. And in terms of whether it's sports performance or mental performance, it's probably the single most studied compound, and specifically the caffeine component from coffee. So we have all these things that probably most of your audience will be doing somewhere in their lives. Cocoa is another thing that has some nootropic activity. Green tea, that would have some degree of nootropic activity, but it's helter-skelter how people do these things. And so if we take something like coffee, there's an old, so I don't know if this term would mean anything to you, but I'm a big fan of the idea of mental models. It's Shane Powers, his blog, fs.blog.com, I think it,
check it out.
Arnhem Street is, and it's named after the Warren Buffett, wherever Berkshire Hathaway's street is. But anyways, this idea of mental models are essentially shortcuts to figure things out. So successful people in different fields often have similar mental models that help them take isolated facts and make sense of them. So one mental model is something called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And I would say I wouldn't think of it as a law like a law of physics, but it's a good, useful model. And what it is, it's essentially like a U-shaped curve like this. And so if we took over here with a low dose of something like caffeine and increase the dose, we're going to get some degree of performance benefit. We're going to go up, 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 up. And so that would be arousal, because that's the main thing that caffeine does. But if we kept consuming higher doses of caffeine, we would plateau, and then our performance would be counterproductive. And what would often suffer our notion that we were doing a good job would go up, keep going up, but our accuracy, things like that, would be going down. So a lot of substances, caffeine being the classic one, track through this curve. And whether you call it Yerkes-Dodson or just an adaptational curve, the key thing is to always, whatever we're doing, take enough so that we're gaining this part, but stop or do something that balances it so that we don't start sliding down the slope. And so what happens with coffee, what you'll see is this idea of like almost over caffeinated. That's when you would get the jitteriness. You tend to get, maybe colder hands. You'd get a lot of things that would be suboptimal for performance. And what you would also get is, like I said, the trade-off with so in physics, there's this idea of speed, and then there's something else that's velocity. And the difference is that velocity is speed with direction. So what caffeine does, it gives a lot of speed, but after a threshold of dose, you lose all the direction.
Gotcha.
Right? And so the key thing in nootropics is that field has advanced to say, okay, we want to get the best of what coffee can offer or what caffeine can offer, but how do we then not, go over the edge and get more of other things as well? And so a compound that's in green tea, theanine, helps to do that. It is a great, in terms of a mini stack. And in the nootropic world, we use the idea of stack when we're putting things together. So it might be a small stack of 2 or 3 ingredients. It might be a big comprehensive stack like one of the Qualia products.
Gotcha. I'm glad that you compared this to caffeine, because so many people out there use caffeine religiously.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, don't talk to me before I've had my coffee. And they might be, oh, but I don't want to take a smart drug. Well, you're already taking a smart drug.
Yeah, you're taking the most studied one, probably.
Yes, luckily for them, the one that we know most about. But this is just an evolution, and for some people, their DNA metabolizes caffeine differently.
Absolutely.
There's fast metabolizers and slow metabolizers, correct? So that just means whether or not it has, like how long the effect is,
Mm-hmm.
or if it's going to have much of effect at all. It has almost no effect on me in the positive.
Yeah.
But I think adrenally, the adrenals still know that caffeine's going on, right? So I'm not getting any benefit, probably just the negative, which is why I love that you guys made a caffeine-free version of Qualia Mind, which is what I take. Because if you're not getting the benefits, then don't take the drug.
Right.
And it's cool to have had my DNA tested. I went through DNA testing, and 23andMe said, okay, this is your caffeine. You're a fast metabolizer. And I always knew that. I'm like, I could have caffeine. I could have caffeine before bed. Doesn't really have an impact on me, but it also won't wake me up in the morning if I'm tired.
Well, I'm super sensitive. I do really well with coffee or caffeine in the morning, but anytime afternoon, even a decaf, which is going to be super low in caffeine, would be enough to affect sleep for me at night.
Gotcha. Yeah, see, everybody's very different. That's why some people think, oh, this DNA testing, it might be too much, but it's little facts like that I get out of it that help me know, okay, because I always thought I better never have caffeine at night, even though I noticed, well, it's not really affecting me. Now I have some scientific proof to back it up. And it's not for everybody, but for my data fans out there who like to know what's going on with their DNA, it was $100 or whatever it was at the time. And so then I can take something like Qualia and I think, okay, I don't need the caffeine. It's not really going to affect me. Let's go with the caffeine-free formula. So something like Qualia, it just helps you, there's different formulations.
Yes.
Can you explain the difference between focus and mind?
So,
by the way, between Qualia focus and Qualia mind, if people are like, those are two random opposite things, those are two different types of Qualia.
So Qualia Mind is the older of the two products. Qualia Focus is a lot newer, and really is a subset of Mind. So there's a few dosing things that are slightly different, but one of the things that I would say Qualia Mind, it was the one that's more studied. And we also included things like algyl DHA, which is an essential fat that the brain uses, phosphatidylserine that is hugely helpful for stress, but also helps to heal the membranes in the brain. And so those things are in mind, but aren't in focus. One of the things we did was to remove that, what we would think of as the lipid stack. In part, we did that because algyl DHA still smells like algae. And for some people, I grew up in a beach town near Cape Cod. I love that smell. But even in our office, we have some people that it's a deal breaker. And so when we removed that, we decided we would remove the lipid stack and then at some point do a standalone lipid product in a soft gel that would also, at this point, we're going to have things in for vision and some other aspects of cognition, but really a lipid-focused product. So one of the main things is those things that are really helpful for long-term membrane health and healing of the membranes aren't in focus, but are in mind. So for someone that's in my age range, those would be much more important than maybe someone that's 20, eating a fair amount of fish, things like that.
Gotcha.
Rather than being redundant, they're covering those bases in the diet. But for a vegan, maybe where they're not getting those things, then it would definitely be worth the extra price to get them somewhere, whether it's in our product or something else that they're doing.
Gotcha. And what do you notice if you take Focus or Mind?
You know, I've never taken Focus regularly other than when we experimented. And when we experimented, what we found is it was almost an exact 50-50 split. So we blinded it and then had people take it for, I think it was 2 weeks, and had them fill out different surveys, 1 day, 5 days, 2 weeks. And really people couldn't distinguish between the two short term, which is kind of what we expected, because the things we largely removed are things that are much more long term in their effects. So I would say in terms of mine, though, I have a lot of experience. I have a lot of experience with the original two-step stack. And the single, or I'd say the two things that I've noticed the most, one is, like we talked about at the beginning, my desire to procrastinate completely vanished. So I usually now wake up really excited about immersing myself in something that would be more work-related or professional development related. And the other thing is, I don't get any what I would think of as an afternoon slump in performance. So that kind of mid-afternoon fatigue, brain foggy, I don't get. And for me, I only take 4 capsules of the Mind, which our dose recommendation is a maximum typically of 7. And for me, I don't need to get that high to feel like I get, you know, the benefits of the formula. So those have been the two things that right away I noticed, and they've been durable.
I love that. Decrease procrastination and decrease afternoon slump. If that's just, you need to make that your ad. Like, that's all people, what are most entrepreneurs and anybody, even if you're going to an office job where you're not starting up doing your own thing, you don't want that afternoon slump, and you probably not want to procrastinate, whether or not it's your work or somebody else's work.
Yeah. And I think, so there's this idea in the nootropic community, if you were on, you know, Reddit or in any of the, like Nootropedia, places that would focus on it, you'll hear something, your mileage may vary. So YMMV. Yes. And the idea is that my N of 1, my experience with, you know, this nootropic stack isn't necessarily going to be yours. So one of the things that we believe as a company is that if we take something like caffeine, since we talked about it, is to think in terms of response groups. So the way I organize it and the way we as a company do is, you're going to typically have some subset of people that are super responders to something, and a lot of that's genetics. Yeah. You're going to have then a bigger group usually that are going to be good responders. You're going to have then a subset that are going to be non-responders. It's just, you know, it's not going to work for them, and then a subset that are going to have some type of a negative response. Some of that's probably also genetic. Yeah. So one of our goals is, we don't think we can create things that aren't going to be spread across those 4 groups. But we do think we can iterate formulations, tests, and kind of rejigger the recipe till we get a formulation that shifts the distribution. So we get a disproportionate amount of super responders. But your super response and mine, my good response and yours, could be different. So for people that are much more creative, feedback that our customer service tends to get a lot is it quiets their inner critic, is kind of the phrasing that I've heard. And I'm creativity is really not my thing, so that's not what I experience. And so what we see when people come up to us at shows is what they tell us that they've experienced doesn't necessarily match me, but we do hear the things I mentioned routinely. But we hear lots of other things, and in honesty, we do get some people that experience nothing. It's part of the reason we do a money-back guarantee, because, you know, we don't believe any product works for everyone. You know, we're thrilled when people want to give it a try, do their own N of 1 with us. But if it doesn't work, we don't want them to be penalized by that. I love every part of that. That's great. It's so important to silence the inner critic. So there's another amazing thing. If that's, I love that's one of the effects that people have come to you and told you about. That's incredible. I just started taking the Mind recently. I was taking the 2-step for years. Ran out a bit ago. I just got some Mind. So I loved it. I walked in this morning and I was like, I only took 4. He's like, I only take 4. And I thought I was taking like a baby dose. I'm glad to know that that's okay. Well, I really appreciate you sharing so much knowledge and your own personal experience with the listeners. Where can they find you or Neurohacker, any of these
things we've been talking about?
So it's neurohacker.com is our website, but we've got Facebook, Instagram. In addition, so really I would guess in a big picture, we're most known for Qualia, to the extent that sometimes when I'll mention to someone I work at Neurohacker, it won't register, but if I mention Qualia, it's like, oh, you're the Qualia people.
Yeah.
But so that's our first product, and we introduced Qualia, really a brain product, because our feeling was, and this would probably resonate with your approach with quitting, is that when we have like more mental capacity to do things, we make better decisions. We may choose better foods. We may get to the exercise routine that we've been planning on doing. We tend to do a lot of big things to an extent, make us a better version of ourselves. And we plan on doing other things, like hitting other aspects. So we're going to move into what we would think of as the healthy aging space in the spring with a product that's more focused on mitochondrial health, things like that. But another big part of what we do as Neurohacker Collective is we try to do things with educating our community. So a phrase that we would use internally is one of our values is elevating the conversation. So we want to, create smarter, more discerning community of people like your audience would be. And that can be in all kinds of areas. So we have our Collective Insights podcast where we interview, like you do, a range of really brilliant guests on everything from gut microbiome to nootropics to you can almost go in any direction.
And that they can find that on iTunes, Spotify, all the places?
Yes.
What's it called again?
Collective Insight.
Collective Insight.
And it's also, you can get to it from the neurohacker.com website. And I believe we make full transcripts available. I know I tend to, for a lot of, like the Ben Greenfield, I almost always just read the transcript. Because oftentimes there's things that I want to remember, and it just helps me remember them better.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can see them and then just instantly you're already there, you can just click on it and go investigate further. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your time with us, and I'm sure we'll have you on again because I love talking about this morning routine and this focus and all the above. So
can I just say one more thing? I'm not sure when this is going to air, but we're going to start to experiment with Facebook Live events. So we'll be doing our first one on January 2nd, another one 2 weeks later, and they're going to be short. But Mansell Denton and I are going to host the first two. He was the founder of Nootropedia, which is a great resource for people that want to learn more about individual nootropic ingredients. It's I would say that would be my go-to place. But what we're going to do is we're doing a series of blogs on intermittent fasting and other fasting type behaviors to lead into the new year. So we're going to be hosting a Facebook Live event for anyone in your audience that might be considering doing a couple-day fast, time-restricted eating, a fasting mimicking diet, things like that.
Very interesting. Okay, and so they would find that on your Facebook page?
It's linked on our Facebook page.
All right, Neurohacker's Facebook page. Everybody check that out. Thank you again, Dr. Kelly, for being on.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming to our office.
Thank you for having me here. This is a total dream. It's like seeing inside this very cool thing that I've been participating in, via my own health for a few years. So to get to see behind the scenes was a real honor. So thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
All right, for everybody else out there, until next time, happy quitting.